This evening we have Jeff Bean with us, and I keep saying Jeff's going to talk to us about the importance of African American history and why we should all understand it. That's my interpretation of what you're speaking about. I don't know if that's clear or fair.
That's legit.
And Jeff is a retired, and I saw some hugs, so I think some of your former students are here.
They are.
Yeah, good. A retired Flint Public School teacher, and now he's working for Ferris.
Correct.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and if you'd like any information about Neighborhoods Without Borders, please holler at us. We'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's important before we get started to note that yesterday was Tendaji's birthday. And I am wearing a tie tonight. For those of you who know me, that's a rarity. I think the last time I wore a tie was Tendaji's funeral. So I thought it would be appropriate tonight to put that out. I want to start out in 1973. I was a junior in high school at Sturgis High School. For those of you unfamiliar, right here. And was the vice president of the student council. Big deal for Sturgis High School. And one of the things we did with student council was that we ran a student exchange program with different neighboring schools, and the idea was that somebody else would come and spend a day at your school, spend the night at your house, come back to school the next day and go home, and you could share that experience. So I had the opportunity during one of these student exchanges to host somebody from Albion. Now Albion, Michigan is unique in that area of the state because it is primarily an African American community. The college is very white, but this town itself is mostly black. Now in Sturgis, where I live, I knew all 5 black people. Not 5 families, 5 people, knew them all. So when this young man came over to spend the night, or spend the day with us, and then he came home with me, he was going to spend the night with me, in trying to figure out, some commonality in conversation, I asked him about music, because music is very important. And so I said, so what kind of music do you listen to? And he said, I listen to jazz. I said, cool. I've got this record. And put on the Jackson 5 album that I had. Okay. So this is where I started. This was my beginning point. Okay. A far ways away from teaching in Flint some 20 years later. In 1974, my senior year, I was given by one of my social studies teachers the autobiography of Malcolm X. A book that changed my life, quite literally. In looking at what Malcolm was about, first and foremost, he was the first person that gave me an idea that there was a world outside of mine, that there was something that I needed to learn about, that all the stories that I've heard from my family, all the myths and legends that had been swirling around me didn't include anything that Malcolm was talking about. And so it encouraged me to begin to look. And so I went away to school, went to Oakland University, and had an amazing opportunity there. I was given a scholarship to go there, and for some unknown reason, they thought it was a really good idea to give me the money, and then I would pay them back. Mistake on their part. I had a wonderful time. Okay? But at the end of the school year, I had a .001 grade point average. They didn't see a real need for me to come back, and my dad didn't see a real need for me to come home. But so I went out in the world. But in that year, my suite mates, I had been mistakenly placed as a freshman in college with 3 seniors. Okay? And they were amazing individuals. Patrick Patillo grew up on the southeast side of Detroit. And when he graduated, he was a person who really began to first inform me about what real jazz was. So I found out fairly quickly how wrong I had been on that Jackson 5 deal. And Patrick took me down to Baker's Keyboard Lounge in Detroit, where I got to hear people like Miles Davis and Sonny Liston and just some incredible talent. And so Patrick, when he graduated, went down to Mozambique, smuggled himself into South Africa, and this would have been 1975 South Africa, where he taught literacy in the townships until he was captured by the South African police and was found dead in his cell 2 months after his arrest. One of my other roommates, Carlos Manza, came from the Corktown area of Detroit, and Carlos, upon graduation, found himself moving south and ultimately ended up in Nicaragua doing exactly the same thing, teaching literacy. And he was found dead after being captured by the Sandinistas down there because, again, promoting literacy is possibly the most dangerous thing that you can do. My third roommate from that year was a young gentleman named Kurt Cox. And Kurt was a Jewish Maoist from Kalamazoo. A pretty odd combination. But Kurt took himself into Tibet, and that was where he had chosen to set up camp and was teaching in the Tibetan mountains, and was eventually captured by the Chinese government. And he too was killed in captivity. Kurt was the last of us to have passed, and I was able to write a couple of letters to him while he was still in Tibet. And in one of those letters I said, I feel horrible that we've lost Pat and Carlos, and I'm just out here teaching. And Kurt wrote back to me and said, don't you ever think that that isn't important, if for no other reason than to understand you have to tell our story. And that is essentially what my teaching career had been about. It had been about telling their story. And so I think it's important for us to begin to understand that if we have an intention of being an ally, then we have to begin to understand stories that aren't our stories, that aren't comfortable for us to hear. And so that's a key piece about what I'm about as a teacher, and what I think we are about as a group. It was interesting, a couple of years ago, when I first read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, I remember reading that and talking to my son. And I said, you know, Mel, because he's the person I bounce everything on. And I said, I'm really having a hard time. I can't find me in this book. And my son looked at me like I was an absolute idiot and said, you're not in that book, Dad. And that was really difficult for me to deal with. But he was absolutely right. That, you know, I had spent my whole life trying to, you know, find places to fit in and be that unique thing. And this one just didn't have a spot for me. It just wasn't going to work out. That wasn't about me. And that's one of the things as allies we need to learn, is that sometimes it isn't about us. And that's okay. You know, you don't have to get defensive about it. You don't have to prove anything. Because you go through those stages. I remember in, say, 1975, 76, after I had read Malcolm's autobiography and I was trying to figure out this whole piece, you know, I would get out of an elevator, and if a black person got in, I wanted to immediately say, you know, I've read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Like I wanted to be okay somehow. Okay? Because again, my natural inclination is to make it about me. And that's hard not to do. It's what we do as human beings. But it's one of the things that we can change if we begin to pay attention to it. So in 1981, I found myself back in a classroom. I went back to Marygrove College in Detroit and took some classes there. And for those of you who I taught, I did better the second time around. So you're not being taught by idiots. But I was taking, in the first semester of my junior year, I was taking an African American literature class, room 222 on the second floor of the Mountain Cadillac building in Marygrove, with an old gentleman who looked like just your most comfortable grandfather. He was so incredibly unassuming. But I remember walking in the first night and noticing I'm the only white guy in the room. And I was shocked by that. Because I thought African American literature classes were for white people. Because we're the ones that need to learn that. Okay? But it worked out very well for me. The gentleman teaching the class was Dudley Randall. And Dudley is known as a poet. His book, or his poem, The Ballad of Birmingham, about the bombing of the 6th Avenue Street Church in Birmingham, is in almost every anthology in American high school classrooms. But really, Dudley is more going to be remembered through history, much more for who he published than what he wrote. Because in Detroit, Dudley ran the Broadside Press, which was a publishing company that published black poets long before any of the major companies would touch them. And so Dudley, in his African American Lit class every Wednesday night, would bring in each Wednesday one of his friends. And so I sat in a classroom smaller than this room with people like Maya Angelou and Etheridge Knight and Robert Hayden and Toni Morrison and Sonia Sanchez and these absolute giants of poetry. Okay? And I was stunned. And I was given a hard time by every one of them except for Maya Angelou, because I'm convinced she's like America's grandmother. She just, I don't think it's in her to meet. But I was challenged. Why are you here? And I think it's in those conversations that I realized that question needs to be asked. I need to expect that question to be asked. Okay? I can't just be accepting, oh, what a wonderful thing, he's here. Okay? Because there are a lot of people who show up at events that aren't there for quality reasons, that aren't there to support. Okay? And so it's very legitimate to be asked that question. Okay? And so I learned to move past being offended by just about anything. And I think that's one of the things that needs to happen in order to develop allyship, is to be able to hear those things and move past it. So I came to Flint to teach. Taught across the creek here at Flint Central for a number of years. Taught at Whittier for a year, taught out at Southwestern for some time. And in that time, when I left Marygrove, I had the opportunity to develop this idea that I wanted to take these wonderful authors that I've been engaging and take them to somebody who could really use them. So my intention was to come to Flint and deal with a primarily African American student population and share with them these things, empower them, let them know there is a culture, there is a history, there is a body of art that supports who you are. Okay? And in doing that, I was able to, I think, support a lot of young people in that growth. And at the same time, there were white students in my classroom, who had that opportunity then to see being quality literature isn't just being a dead white guy. You know, the classical music has as much to do with electronics as it might with somebody from the Baroque period. And so all of those things were real, all of those things were possible, and I thought for a long time that was my calling. That's what I was about. What I realized was eventually that was just more training for me. Because I would end every year talking to my seniors and say, I've learned more this year than you have. And a lot of times I think students think that's just this nice thing that a teacher says. It was always the truth, that I always learned more from my students than they learned from me. I can guarantee you that. I have had some of the most amazing souls wander through my life and share things with me in ways that have enriched me beyond belief. And so what I realized was, in being trained for that, I was really being prepped for the job I have now. I have been blessed in leaving the teaching profession at the public school level, at the high school level, to work for Ferris State University over on the Mott campus and training teachers. So instead of working with students now, I'm training teachers. And what I'm aware of is that the vast majority of the teachers that I'm training are white. And I'm glad about that. Because I think it's important that I find this way to share all these things that I've learned with these people who are going to go out into the world, into majority white classrooms, and share these ideas. Because if I go back to when I was at Marygrove, I had met another older student. His name was Charles Turner. And when I walked into my very first class, it was a World Cities class. And I'm a back row sitter. So if the door was over there, I came over in this corner and sat down. And Charles came in and said, and stood right in front of me. Nobody else in the room. The professor wasn't in the room yet. Nobody else there. Stood right in front of me and said, what would it take for you to give up that seat? And I said, more than you got, but you can sit right here. And we became great friends for the next 3 years. And he took me around to black businesses that surrounded the Marygrove campus on 6 Mile in Wyoming in Detroit. And I learned about how horrific racism runs and how deep it runs. He introduced me to a guy named Johnny Burns. And Johnny Burns ran a company called Detroit Audio, which was a record store. This is back when they had records. So, that Johnny ran these record stores, and he would go nuts. Because he was running this record store right on 6 Mile, right across from Marygrove. 3 miles away was Southland Mall, or Northland Mall. Was it Northland Mall? Northland Mall. And everybody from the neighborhood would go to Northland to buy their records, paying $2 more an hour. And why would they do that? Because Northland is perceived to be white, and Johnny was running a black business. It got to a point where he explained to me at one point, he even hired a white guy to walk around the store and say he was the manager, to see if he could get more business that way. This is how insidious the thing is that we deal with. So Charles, upon my graduation, when I was getting ready to graduate, he said, where are you going to go? And I was thinking about going back to Sturgis. And he said, you don't want to go back there. I said, what, are you going to go? And he laughed. He said, you know, iron hair is not going back to Sturgis. It's not going to happen. And I said, but he was right. You know, I wanted to get into things. I wanted to help people. But I've come to realize I need to go back to Sturgis too. this last election has proven to us that we need to educate the population, that everybody needs to wake up about stuff. And so we can't be complacent. We can't get comfortable. So what I'm doing, I was given the opportunity, Ferris offers what they call a development grant. This was pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago, for about $7,000. And so I got a hold of somebody who is a friend of mine here in the Flint area, Dell Thomas Jackson, for anybody who knows Dell. And I said, so here's the deal. I got a School of Ed faculty in Big Rapids, mostly white, mostly female, all upper middle class, who think they are incredibly liberal. Would you be willing to talk with them and work with them and possibly wake them up a little bit? And he laughed. He said, $7,000. So Delma's going to work with me. He connected me with a woman from Washington, D.C., who is one of President Obama's Teachers of the Year. And we're going to develop a workshop that will take place on a Friday afternoon, Saturday morning, in Big Rapids, to get a faculty who have absolutely nothing to gain in their mind through this, but I'm aware that they have everything to gain, and begin to discover their points of privilege, so that once they get to that idea, they can begin to develop syllabuses for teacher preparation methods classes that will include what every teacher needs to be balanced as they go out into the world. Because my student teachers are going to go out and teach in places like Davison, in Swartz Creek, in Grand Blanc. And that's where African American history and African American literature needs to be taught. Because if you're teaching George Washington and not having Denmark Vesey standing right beside him, you missed something. If you're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and not bring up Pontiac or Sitting Bull, then you've missed something. So these things are what are key in us beginning to develop positive allyship. It's difficult, I'll be honest with you, it's difficult for me to listen to the radio or the news all the time. I just want to throw things at my TV set or at my radio. And I have to realize that I can't do that. That's not productive. So what is it I can do? What I can do is educate. That as somebody who has gone through a recovery program, one of the most powerful things that I've always said is, what it taught me is, there is no they. I don't get to talk about those people. It's always the people I'm going to work with. The people that piss me off the most are the people I need to sit down with. Because I'm real clear that nobody is a throwaway. And so that we've got to understand that the people we have these disagreements with are the people we need to have the conversations with. It's hard to do that sometimes, especially today when people speak from incredibly horrible sources of information, and believe that all they have to do is speak 2-3 words and that's it, I'm done. That people who know me, there was a gentleman when I was going to Mary Grove who was from the east side of Detroit and had a lot of difficulty with people of color. And he would come into my room and he would be just screaming mad. And we would have these long, long conversations. And one night as he was leaving, he said, why is it every time I come in here, I'm so ticked off, and every time I leave, I think you're the smartest person in the world. And I smiled at him. I said, Ed, it's because I love you. And I'm only always going to speak to that. It's one of the things as allies we have to learn to do, is to speak to the powerful person that is inside. Sometimes that person is incredibly trapped through cultures that these people have grown up in, through a country that is terrified of sharing its power. But we've got to find those parts of people and speak to those people and train them. Because eventually we'll reach a critical mass. We are never going to have a world where we're all going to have a group hug and Coke and a smile and it'll be great. But we can turn the majority towards common sense. And I guess somewhere in the back of my head I still believe that's true right now. That the majority does have common sense. They just didn't get out and vote. They got lazy.